Electric light? At 10 at night? Hans Weber murmured, pressing his nose against the train car window. Outside, Texas sparkled like an inverted firmament. "Is this America?" whispered Carl, the engineer. "Or are we being fooled by a Hollywood trick?" The silence among the prisoners spoke more than fear. It was the sound of the German myth cracking. The locomotive stopped slowly in Mexia, and the heat of the Texan night entered like a slap. As he stepped down, Hans expected insults, stones, shouting guards. Instead, he saw smiling women, waving children, and flags hanging lazily from porches. It was a reception of the curious, not of victors. He didn't know if he felt humiliation or astonishment. The lights unsettled him the most. They didn't go out. Not in the houses, not on the poles, not in the stores. In Germany, the word blackout was routine. Here, it seemed like an insult. His stomach churned, not from hunger, but from contradiction. The war devouring the world seemed not to touch that place. In the diary he kept hidden under his shirt, he scribbled hastily, "If this is war, then the Reich lives in medieval ruins." Around him, the other prisoners gazed at the surroundings like those seeing a miracle or a trap. The air smelled of oil, corn, and freedom. When the American guards led them to the Pullman cars, Hans had another shock. Leather seats, ventilation, wide windows. He expected wagons, received comfort. A tall sergeant with a southern drawl said simply, "You travel like soldiers, not like cattle." Simple words, but they echoed. They thought the United States were weak, a nation of dreamers, drowned in luxury and comfort. But when thousands of captured German soldiers stepped onto American soil, what they saw destroyed everything they believed in. Cities that never slept, farms that glowed at night, food that never ended. This wasn't the America of Nazi propaganda. It was a superpower built not on fear, but on light, abundance, and freedom. Stay with me, because what these men discovered inside the world of their enemies didn't just end a war, it ended an illusion. And when you see what they saw, you'll never see history the same way again. The train moved slowly, lulled by the soft metallic sound. Outside, the city disappeared among illuminated fields. Yes, even the farms had electric light. "It's impossible," Carl repeated. "Even Berlin isn't like this." Hans averted his gaze, trying to preserve what remained of his belief in German superiority. In the next car, someone began to sing a military song softly. He was hushed by another, "Quiet. They might understand." But the guards didn't care. They were busy talking, laughing, eating. That lightness offended Hans. How could they laugh in the midst of a world war? When the train passed over a bridge, Hans saw his reflection in the glass, dirty, thin, with hungry eyes and a worn uniform. Behind the reflection, an infinite row of lights. He didn't know if he was seeing the future or the end of an illusion. At the back of the car, Carl whispered, "They don't need to win battles. They've already won the real world." Hans didn't reply. He just closed the diary and looked once more at the farms shining like constellations on the ground. At that moment, he didn't know it, but his surrender had already begun. Not to the Americans, but to reality. The Texan morning sun rose heavy, gilding the hills and the train car windows. The train stopped, and the prisoners were instructed to disembark in a line. On the ground, signs in English and arrows painted with precision. Even the logistics of imprisonment seemed to have a mechanical purpose. Hans felt shame for the improvisation with which his army did everything. The townspeople gathered to see the desert Germans. There was no hate in the faces, just curiosity. Children pointed and laughed when the soldiers waved timidly. An elderly man handed a bottle of water to a prisoner without hesitation. Carl commented in a low voice, if this were in Germany, that old man would be denounced for treason. The guards distributed instructions in German. One of them, with a heavy accent, said, "Follow the line. You'll get food and the bath." Hans blinked, confused. A bath? After weeks in the African desert and days of crossing, that seemed a luxury reserved for generals. In the makeshift dining hall, the smell of fresh bread and hot coffee filled the air. The men stood still, waiting for the trick. But there was no trick. Metal trays, clean glasses, meat served in generous portions. Hans bit into the white bread and tasted defeat more sharply than African dust. At night, lying on organized bunks, he heard the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of a living city. A guard passed between the rows, checking notes calmly. "Sleep well, gentlemen," he said in a cordial tone. Hans turned on his side, uncomfortable. "They treat us like humans. This is strategy, not kindness." Carl laughed, muffled. "Maybe kindness is the strategy." Hans didn't reply. The phrase disturbed him more than any Hitler speech. In the early morning hours, he couldn't sleep. He wrote in the diary, "America fights us with electricity, bread, and silence, and it's winning." The train set off again toward the interior. Along the tracks, cultivated fields stretched to the horizon. Each mile seemed an accusation against the idea that the Reich was the pinnacle of civilization. In the last paragraph of the night, he noted something he barely understood. Maybe power isn't in subjugating peoples, but in not needing to destroy them. Before continuing, I want to tell you something. If stories like this make you see history from a new perspective, stay with us. Subscribe now and dive into the forgotten moments that shaped our world. Outside, the train crossed an illuminated bridge, as if the country itself refused to turn off the lights, even in wartime. The dock at Oran was a living organism. Lines marked with precision, men in silence, American sergeants circulating with clipboards and fluent instructions in German. No shouts, no confusion, just the dry symphony of stamps falling on documents. Hans Weber, who had served months in the dust of North Africa, had never seen an enemy organize something with such calm. This is efficiency, not arrogance, he thought. When the vaccine needle pierced his arm, he shuddered more from astonishment than pain. A neutral-faced doctor instructed him in German. To avoid fever. Good luck, soldier. Soldier. The word sounded different coming from an enemy. Carl, the engineer, watched everything fascinated. They treat capture like a process, not punishment. Hans noted in the diary, "They organize us like we organize machines." An officer explained the camp rules in nearly perfect German. Talking about rights, work, and hygiene to prisoners of war seemed absurd, but the clipboards didn't lie. The tables were clear. Mail released, balanced meals, mandatory baths. Their discipline is human, ours inhuman. Hans pretended not to hear but felt the phrase lodge itself. In the waiting area, American soldiers distributed bread and hot coffee. The smell made the Germans glance at each other like wary animals. No one ate until the first dared. When they tasted it, the tension broke. They chewed like swallowing their own pride. "They win even with kindness," Hans wrote, pressing the pencil until the graphite broke. The boarding organization seemed like a mechanical ballet. Boxes, men, lists, and schedules fit without flaws. In Germany, improvisation is a virtue. Here, it's a failure. Carl's comment sounded like a confession. Hans pretended to note something else, but engraved every word. The Atlantic seemed smaller before the security of those who mastered it. The translator, a young man with a mixed accent, observed the confused faces and smiled. "You'll see what it's like for an entire country to work like a single factory." The phrase echoed among the prisoners like superstition. Hans looked at the ships and thought, "They don't build empires, they build systems." It was a deadly difference. At dusk, the port turned into an artificial constellation. Spotlights spun, reflecting off metallic hulls. No shouts, no chaos, just engines and short commands. Hans felt shame remembering European ports. Noise, haste, disorganization. Here, even silence had hierarchy.
A doctor collected forms with hypnotic efficiency. Carl noticed boxes marked penicillin, medical use, and whispered, "They heal prisoners, Hans, while our wounded die from lack of sulfa." Hans averted his gaze, feeling his skin prickle. Being treated like a human by the enemy was a new kind of humiliation. The Liberty ships waited like sleeping giants. An American sailor commented casually, "The Robert E. Peary was built in 4 days." 4 days. Hans almost laughed until he saw the simple pride on the man's face. "Propaganda floats?" Carl asked, ironically. "No, propaganda doesn't sail," the sailor replied. The following silence weighed more than any argument. When the boarding siren echoed, Hans's heart beat in rhythm with the machines. He climbed the ramp like entering another era. The hull smelled of paint and hot metal. The engine sound seemed the heartbeat of an iron god. He looked back, to Africa, to Germany, to the past, and felt that the world he knew was already receding. The first shock wasn't the sea, it was the bread. White slices, soft, aligned on gleaming metal trays. The aroma of freshly brewed coffee invaded the mess hall and drew a collective murmur from the prisoners. Hans, hungry and suspicious, took a piece with trembling fingers. He bit slowly, expecting the bitter taste of defeat, but he found sweetness, and that hurt more. On the ship, the food service worked like a living assembly line. Men in clean aprons moved spoons like pistons. Portions were measured but generous. Meat twice a day, colorful vegetables, cold milk. Carl looked around perplexed. "This is an insult." A sailor laughed. "No, this is routine." While eating, Hans observed the radar operators, the antennas spinning on deck, and the sailors exchanging short codes naturally. "Even freighters have radar," he thought, surprised. "They see where we still grope." Technical superiority didn't come from pomp, but from normalcy, and that made it invincible. In the trash, food scraps, meat, bread, fruit, accumulated without guilt. "Waste," spat a prisoner. Hans looked at the bins like contemplating heresy. "It's not waste, it's power," he wrote. "Abundance is the quietest enemy." He understood then that deep down the war was lost before even disembarking. The sailors explained with pride that every part of the ship came from a different state. Engines from Ohio, valves from California, steel from Pennsylvania. "The whole country works on parts of the same body," one said. Hans looked at the hull and imagined the map of the United States pulsing inside the steel. It was an organism, not a nation.
At night, the mess hall turned into a refuge. Letters, laughter, cigarettes. Guards and prisoners shared the same space without hostility. They fight but don't hate, Hans thought, surprised by the serenity around. Carl raised his glass of milk, mocking, a toast to the most civilized victory in history. Hans couldn't laugh. On deck, the wind cut the face, and the sea roared with patience. A guard passed, waving a "Good night, gentlemen." The word sounded strange, but true. Hans realized that, somehow, he no longer felt like a prisoner, just small. The enemy didn't chain him, it just showed what freedom was. Lying in his bunk, Hans heard the deep rumble of the engine mixed with footsteps in the corridors. Each American step seemed to measure distances between centuries. He opened the diary and wrote, "They move food like we move ammunition. The difference is that theirs nourishes, ours destroys." A storm broke out in the early morning hours. The ship rocked, but the crew kept the rhythm. Men laughed, played cards, drank coffee. The sea raged, and America remained impassive. Hans realized that confidence came from within, not from slogans. At dawn, the sun pierced the hull cracks and gilded the metallic floor. The smell of bread returned, the coffee steamed. Hans got up and ate without thinking. For the first time, it wasn't hunger, it was surrender. "They don't win with the sword," he wrote in the diary. "They win by living better while fighting." The Atlantic breathed like an ancient animal, and the American ship cut its waves with the serenity of one who knows the path. Hans leaned on the railing, observing the cables, antennas, and spotlights that spun with mathematical precision. Each piece seemed to fulfill an invisible duty. They don't improvise, they calculate even the wind, he thought, as the engine's sound echoed like a modern prayer. In the radar room, a green screen pulsed like an electronic heart. A sailor, too young for the war, tracked glowing dots with almost domestic calm. Hans watched him fascinated. That machine saw the enemy before the enemy knew it existed. It was a kind of power that didn't roar, just observed. Germany hides behind ideology, America behind technology, he noted in the diary. In the ship's corridors, the smell of oil and clean metal mixed with the perfume of fresh bread. It was an impossible contradiction, efficiency and comfort coexisting in the middle of the ocean. Carl, leaning on the doorframe, commented, "The difference is they produce security, we produce fear." Hans didn't reply, but felt the weight of the phrase bind him more than shackles. One night, a fierce storm hit the freighter. The hull groaned, the mast swayed, but the crew maintained the routine. No one shouted, no one ran. The captain watched the radar like reading a map of his own soul. Their discipline is silent, Hans thought, admiring and irritated at the same time. Chaos there obeyed orders. When the sky cleared, the deck was washed. The air smelled of iron and salt. Hans looked around and realized no one celebrated the end of the storm. They simply continued. Normality was America's greatest victory, a normality even nature couldn't shake. They don't conquer the sea, he wrote, they just convince it to cooperate. The ship slid into Norfolk like a tired monster. When Hans stepped onto the dock, the air smelled of coal, grease, and coffee. Cranes moved like metallic giraffes, hoisting tons of cargo with the lightness of dancers. He stopped, stunned, looking at rows of containers, trucks, and men moving without noise, like human gears. The port was a living city, breathing steel.
An American soldier pointed to the cranes and said, "Today we move more than Hamburg in a week." Hans laughed a disbelief, but the laugh died quickly. Locomotives crossed, ships unloaded without pause, and even the sailors seemed part of an invisible choreography. "Germany builds to show power," he wrote. "America builds so it works." The trains waited aligned, each with destination, load, and time defined. No delays, no confusion. Each par is a word in the same language, Hans thought. Carl nudged him, pointing to a row of parked cars. "Look, the workers come to work by automobile." Hans froze. In Germany, that was a general's privilege. Here, it was Tuesday. As he walked through the port, he observed a group of stevedores unloading grain from huge barges. The sweet smell of wheat invaded the air. "They move food like we move ammunition," Carl whispered. The phrase seemed to echo among the mountains of stacked sacks. Hans realized the symbolic weight. A country that turns abundance into routine doesn't need to fear hunger, nor fear. At night, the prisoner convoy boarded modern trains, with wide windows and air conditioning. The port lights receded, flickering like artificial constellations. Hans felt a shiver, not from cold, but from understanding. What defeated the Reich wasn't the battlefield, he wrote in the diary. It was their everyday life. The train left Norfolk at dawn, gliding with an almost insulting smoothness. Hans observed the cars. They weren't freight, but passenger cars, with cushioned seats, dining cars, and constant ventilation. Guards passed naturally, offering water and even newspapers. It was all so absurd that the prisoners glanced at each other in silence. This isn't captive transport, Hans thought. It's a parade of efficiency. The landscape raced by the window. Cultivated fields, clean villages, houses with chimneys smoking in domestic rhythm. There was order, abundance, and light. "They light the countryside like we light factories," Carl commented. Hans noted in the diary, "If war were decided by electricity, we'd already be surrendered." The train, in its silent comfort, was a sermon on civilization. In the dining car, the smell of fresh coffee mixed with the metallic sound of cutlery. The trays came balanced in firm hands, the air conditioning blew a constant breeze. Hans looked at the ceiling, confused. The enemy seemed more concerned with the well-being of its prisoners than the Reich with its heroes. "They don't defeat us with force, but with contrast," he wrote. As the convoy crossed the Virginia fields, a row of electric poles followed the tracks, lighting small farms even under the sun. "Do you have electric light in the countryside?" he asked a guard. The man replied laughing, "Since the 1920s, sir." Hans felt the ground tremble from inside out. It was the kind of information that dismantled entire ideologies. When the train stopped for a locomotive change, Hans saw his own face's reflection in the glass. He was dirty, tired, aged, and behind him the reflection of the station lights, always on. "They don't turn anything off," he murmured. Carl heard and replied, "Maybe that's why they don't lose anything." The train whistle cut the silence like a sentence. The future had electric motors. As night fell, the train crossed the heart of industrial America. Entire cities pulsed under the constant glare of lamps. Factories roared like tireless beasts, spewing smoke and light at the same time. Hans pressed his forehead to the window, hypnotized. They produce in the darkness as if it were day, and for the first time the word miracle lost its religious tone.
Chimneys moved in rows, streets swarmed with trucks, and even small stations seemed nerve centers of a living body. Carl watched attentively, measuring the speed of the convoys. "Germany rations everything. They expand everything," he said, almost enviously. Hans noted, "They don't have blackouts. They have confidence." And that confidence seemed worth more than any tank. The prisoners peeked through the windows, like contemplating another planet. A guard, noticing the fascination, commented, "You haven't seen the Detroit factories yet." The tone wasn't provocative, but genuine pride. Hans smiled without irony. "They don't talk about glory, they talk about production." It was a difference as vast as the ocean they had crossed. Further ahead, the train crossed an immense bridge over a gleaming river. The city reflected in the water seemed to double its own size. The workers leaving the factories seemed happy, exhausted, but owners of a purpose. Hans thought of Germans returning from night shifts in the dark, drained and hungry. "They have energy. We had slogans," he noted silently. In that instant, he understood something he couldn't explain. The light he saw in the streets wasn't just electric, it was symbolic. It was proof that America fought with engines, but also with ideas. The war there wasn't just of armies, it was of ways of living. And for the first time, Hans realized he was witnessing the birth of the world that would come after defeat. The train arrived in Tennessee under a leaden sky, and Hans was struck by an almost unreal vision. An entire city built around a factory. Cooling towers, tracks, white smoke, trucks entering and exiting non-stop. The name Alcoa shone in polished metal letters as if industry itself took pride in it. "This isn't a plant," he thought. "It's a heart pulsing aluminum." An American engineer explained to the guards, "This factory consumes more electricity than entire European cities." Hans laughed, incredulous, but the lights didn't lie. Thousands of them on, day and night, without hesitation. Carl, beside him, murmured, "They tamed lightning." The phrase sounded poetic, but it was pure truth. Germany still struggled with coal, the Americans with raw energy. The prisoners were allowed to see part of the operations. Conveyors, furnaces, automatic cranes. The sound was constant but ordered. No shouts, no panic, just work on a cosmic scale. Hans observed ordinary men in overalls coordinating precision machines. In Germany, this would be controlled by officers, he thought. Here, power seemed to belong to everyone. During lunch, the workers shared tables with soldiers and supervisors. They talked about football, politics, movies, without visible hierarchy. An American joked, "Here, even the president needs the worker." Hans swallowed hard. That dismantled all the logic of his country. Collective pride seems stronger than any individual cult. He has an invisible Führer, the system, he noted silently. At dusk,
Alcoa's lights reflected on distant mountains. The ground trembled with the sound of presses, and the air smelled of ozone and victory. Hans looked at Karl and said, "If Hitler saw this, he'd call it a lie." Karl replied, serious, "That's why he'll lose." The ex-German officer realized he was, for the first time, on the same side as his enemy, the side of reality. In Michigan, the horizon seemed a continuous line of concrete and steel. Hans could hardly believe that was a factory. Willow Run, Fords. The size was inhuman. "The size of a city," Karl commented, slack-jawed. An American soldier replied, "It is a city, only it flies." The sound of pneumatic hammers and tested engines made the air vibrate like constant thunder.
A military guide explained with restrained pride. A B-24 bomber rolls out ready every 63 minutes. Hans almost laughed until he saw one slide down the assembly line before his eyes. It was an industrial choreography. Men, women, tools, and engines danced in mechanical synchrony. "This is what the Reich called American propaganda," Karl murmured. "Propaganda that flies," Hans replied. The structure seemed alive. Internal tracks moved parts. Cranes slid on the ceiling. Platforms vibrated under the weight of giant wings. Hans noted everything mentally, trying to understand how an entire society could move without whips, without fear, just by belief in efficiency. They don't march for a man, he thought. They march for a purpose. From a walkway high up, he saw a worker teaching a novice. No shouts, no humiliation, just patience and precision. The novice botched the fit, and the veteran just smiled. "Try again, kid. Here, error is part of learning." Hans closed his eyes, trying to imagine such a phrase in a German factory. Impossible. There, error was crime. When the day ended, a freshly assembled bomber took to the skies, gleaming under the sunset. The workers applauded, proud, and Hans felt a lump in his throat. "They build wings while we dig trenches," he wrote in the diary. For the first time, he didn't feel like a prisoner, just a witness to a civilization that turned work into victory. When the trains finally stopped in Texas, Hans expected fences, mud, and shouts. Instead, he found Camp Hearn, clean, lit, and absurdly organized. Spacious tents, polished wooden bunks, toilets, electric light, and hot showers. An American soldier handed out blankets and said, "Welcome, gentlemen." The word echoed with painful irony. Gentlemen, not prisoners. At night, the hanging lamps in the tents cast soft, almost cozy shadows. Hans laid down, but couldn't sleep. The Texan heat mixed with the moral discomfort of being well treated by the enemy. "They defeat us with hospitality," he wrote in the diary. Karl in the next bunk whispered, "It's easier to hate who hurts you, Hans. Hard to hate who respects you." He didn't reply. In the following days, the camp routine seemed more like a disciplined village than a prison. Fixed schedules, hearty meals, on-duty doctors, and even a small library. Guards walked unhurriedly, exchanging laughs with prisoners learning English. "They're not afraid of us, and maybe that's why they dominate us completely," Hans thought, observing the uniform glow of the nighttime lamps. The food continued to be an affront. White bread, hot coffee, meat twice a day. That everyday luxury dismantled any argument about capitalist decadence. "If this is American misery, I want to live in it," Karl wrote, drawing muffled laughs. Hans pretended to laugh too, but inside he felt something breaking, an ideological axis that had turned since childhood, now slowing to a stop. One afternoon, Hans saw American workers installing new power lines near the fences. One waved and shouted, "Want more light in there, Doc?" The joke was simple, but it pierced Hans like lightning. He smiled without knowing why. Maybe it was the irony. German prisoners, behind barbed wire, being gifted more clarity. They illuminate even the captives, he noted. And maybe that's how they free us. Winter arrived, and with it came colds and fevers. Hans was coughing in the mess hall when a guard directed him to the medical post. The white building, clean, smelled of disinfectant and soap. An American nurse with firm eyes and soft voice examined him calmly. "X-ray and penicillin," she said, as if trivial. Hans froze. In Germany, penicillin was rumor, not reality. While waiting, he saw Karl being treated for an infection.
The doctor cleaned the wounds carefully, chatting like tending a colleague. "You're an engineer, right? You'll like how we set up the new generator." Carl smiled, confused. Hans watched, trying to understand what he saw. "They heal enemies. No ideology explains that."
During the night, Margaret Lewis, the nurse, returned to the infirmary bringing extra blankets. "Texas is hot, but the wind changes," she said, adjusting Hans's pillow. He tried to thank her in English, stammering. She just replied, "War doesn't need hate, just an end." The phrase sounded like prophecy. In that instant, Hans realized he might be witnessing the end of something bigger than a war. The next day, the recovered prisoners returned to the camp. Hans felt light, but disturbed. It was impossible to hate who treated him better than his own army. "Nazism taught us to despise the enemy," he wrote, "but no one prepared us to be healed by him. The penicillin healed the body, the shame, the spirit." Each dose was a lesson. In the afternoon, Margaret bid them farewell before heading to another camp. "Take care," she said with a tired smile. Hans tried to say something, but only managed to stammer, "Danke." She waved and left. Carl looked at his friend and murmured, "Their medicine is more dangerous than their weapons." Hans replied, serious, "Yes, because it heals hate." September 1943. The Texas heat began to yield, and the prisoners were sent to work on local farms. Hans watched tractors moving like metallic beasts over the flat soil, driven by simple men, many too young for the war. Each farm had electricity, irrigation, and gleaming machines. He noted in the diary, "The common man here commands the power our army tries to conquer by force." As they worked, the guards chatted naturally. They talked about wages, cars, movies, and life plans. "They believe in tomorrow," Carl commented. "We learned to fear the future." Hans didn't reply, he just observed the field, lit even at dusk. It was as if American soil itself refused darkness. The contrast with hungry, rationed Germany was an open wound. At night, in the camp, rumors circulated about American reports speaking of an ideological collapse among the prisoners. Hans managed to see a secretly copied excerpt. After months in the United States, prisoners no longer contest production statistics. He stood still, staring at the paper. "They don't need to convince us of anything. Just let us see." Carl, increasingly outspoken, began discussing aloud what he saw. "The Reich lied. They told us America was decadent, weak, enslaved by capital. But look." Some Germans reacted with anger, others with silence. Hans felt fear, not of the Americans, but of his own compatriots. The truth was beginning to divide what remained of pride. One night, a group of fanatics beat Carl for disrespecting the fatherland. Hans tried to intervene, but was held back. When silence returned, he saw his friend lying on the ground, bleeding, but smiling. "They can't silence me anymore," Carl murmured. Hans helped him up and thought, "The war ended inside us, even if outside it still continues." Autumn brought cold air and new shadows of awareness. Hans walked along the camp fences at night, observing the lit lamps on the poles. Each light seemed a cruel reminder that America slept without fear, while Germany lived in the dark. "They don't have blackouts because they trust their own tomorrow," he wrote. "We turned off the lights out of fear of what comes from the sky." One afternoon, American officers inspected the camp. One of them, impressed by the prisoners' discipline, requested a translator, and they called Hans. He climbed the platform, sweating as the others watched. The colonel asked, "How are you being treated?" Hans breathed deep and replied in English, "With dignity that shames my country." The silence that followed weighed like a sentence. After the speech, Hans was isolated by his own compatriots. Some called him a traitor, others mad. Colonel Miller, the camp commander, came to him at night. "You did what a free man would do," he said, handing him a cigarette. Hans smoked in silence, tasting the bitter and sweet of truth. He realized freedom wasn't a right. It was a state of mind. Days later, Carl fell ill and was taken to the infirmary. American penicillin saved him once more, but the incident left marks. Hans visited him and found him weak, but smiling. "Do you still write in the diary?" Carl asked. "Yes," Hans replied. "I write to remember that light exists." Carl closed his eyes and murmured, "Then write quickly, before Germany turns it off for good." That night, Hans left the infirmary and looked at the Texan sky. The stars competed with the clarity of the camp lamps. He opened the diary and wrote his last sentence of that year. "They win because they're not afraid to turn on the light, and we lost because we confused darkness with discipline." After that, the wind blew gently, and the silence seemed, finally, clean. The year 1945 dawned silent in Texas. News of the German surrender arrived in waves of murmur and disbelief. Hans was sitting in the shade of a tent when a guard handed him a newspaper. On the cover, Hitler's face in black and white, and below it, the word "end." He read slowly, without anger, without relief, just with a painful serenity. Germany fell, he thought, but maybe only now can it rise. In the following days, the prisoners walked in silence. No one sang, no one argued. The entire camp seemed suspended between two worlds, the one of obedience and the one of understanding. Carl, still weakened, drew with a stick in the dirt. Planes, factories, tractors. "We didn't lose for lack of faith. We lost for lack of reality." Hans noted, "Truth doesn't need a flag. It shows itself lit." When the repatriation order arrived, Colonel Miller called Hans aside. "You returned different," he said. "Use it." Hans just nodded, but kept the words like receiving a mission. At night, he opened the diary for the last time and wrote, "They taught me that power is making the impossible seem every day. That civilization is winning without needing to humiliate." Then he closed the notebook, not as one ending something, but as one sealing a promise. Months later, already on German soil, what he found was a broken and cold country. Cities in ruins, hungry children, shadows where there had once been parades. When he mentioned the word electricity, they laughed at him. When he spoke of abundant food, they called him a liar. He realized with bitterness that many preferred to remain blind. But it didn't matter. Inside him, the lights of Texas still burned. Years later, the diary was found by an American grandson of one of the Herne Guards. The yellowed pages smelled of rust and sea. The last paragraph said, "They won because they never stopped turning on their lights. Neither outside nor inside." The young man published it, and the world read. Hans Weber's name became a historical footnote, but his words lit something no war could extinguish: the certainty that the most absolute power is the ability to illuminate even the enemy.